Well, way back in the late 60s, early 70s, my parents, were married and vacationed on the beach at Machrihanish with my grandparents. So there's a long family association with the Mull of Kintyre and specifically with Machrihanish. So my father's a golf course superintendent, so I was around the old course at Machrihanish every summer my whole entire childhood. And if I wasn't on the golf course with my father and grandfather, I was playing in the dunes along the water's edge and running out into the surf. So I know that area extremely well, and I knew those stretch of dunes that run from the old course at Machrihanish all the way around to Westport. So I know that whole area extremely well, and as I got into golf course design and had the opportunity to do banding, I obviously thrived in building golf and sand dunes. Who wouldn't? It's the easiest thing to do with the most dramatic effect, and the golfers love it. So in probably the latter 90s into the early part of this decade, I tried numerous times to get people interested in doing a project on the next stretch of dunes. Mike Kaiser, Fred Green, Charles Schwab, and I put together a little packet and talked it through with them. But they all felt that Machrihanish was just too remote, just too far away from the hub in Scotland to make a new golf course to justify it. And the more I looked into it, the more I could see that it could be overcome because of the existing golf course that was there, and because of the improvements on the road. It used to be a 5-hour drive, torturous drive from Glasgow round to Campbelltown. Now it's barely 3 hours on great roads. In a modern car, it's a pleasure. If the weather's obliging, you've got some of the most stunning views in the world along that coastline. So it seemed to me to be a very viable business proposition, and it, almost to the point that when I couldn't persuade previous clients to do it, I thought, well, I'll at least try and get the ball rolling on my own. And I started to investigate, who owned the land and how much it was worth and what it would take to build. And one of the first obstacles I ran into was in my due diligence of that parcel of land. It quickly came out that it's designated a site of special scientific interest. Now, by British standards, SSSI is the highest level of environmental protection that can be designated on a parcel of land. And although I'd worked on courses in the United Kingdom before that had SSSIs within them or bordered onto them, for instance, at the Castle course at St Andrews, the strip of land between the top of the bluff and the high water line is designated a triple SI, and that was the major environmental restriction on that project, was to avoid any runoff going onto it, and to avoid any contamination at all onto that virtual cliff edge. And that was the major point of negotiation in the whole project. It wasn't part of the site, it was just part of the boundary of the site. Here at Machrihanish, the whole entire site was designated triple SI, which by any professional's judgment would mean don't touch. You can do nothing here. You couldn't create a new walk path through it, much less build a modern golf course. And on the face of it, that effectively meant that there was in fact no chance of building golf on those fragile sand dunes. I wasn't completely put off, because wandering across that land, I could see that the current landowner, the farmer, was maybe not doing things in its best interest. There were, dump sites for old pieces of equipment. There were, he was using it as winter grazing for heavy cattle. So cows were out there most of the winter, and their feet were, obviously damaging the dunes, all of which was contrary to what Scottish Natural Heritage, who are charged to protect triple SIs, would want. So we investigated yet further to try and figure out, why is it designated a triple SI? What is it that's important about this piece of land? And as you might expect, it's the vegetation. There are some orchids that grow within that parcel that grow nowhere else in Europe. An incredibly fragile array of plants or ecosystem that's of European significance. So not only do we have a triple SI, we have an incredibly fragile one. And so in our first approaches to Scottish natural heritage, they virtually laughed at us because all they had to compare it to was, Loch Lomond, the Carrick, what we'd just done at St Andrews, all of which were engineering on a fairly dramatic scale, ponds being dug, cart paths being installed, grand clubhouses being built, new vegetation, wholesale clearance of a site and irrigation, drainage, and new grasses sown across all of it, all completely unacceptable to the mandate that Scottish Natural Heritage have to protect the triple SI. So the bottom line at the very start of the inception of this project was we're coming at this from two entirely different perspectives. The Scottish Natural Heritage have an existing legal designation that says you basically can do nothing. And we want to build a world-class golf course, which means we want to do something. However light-handed we say we're going to be, you've been in the golf construction industry. You know that minimalism is still more than not touching a bunch of orchids that are a half inch under the ground. Right. So it was just a question of could we at least start a dialogue and come up with something that would allow us to create golf across these dunes because, they're so spectacular. And what then proceeded was a 2-year process, initially extremely nervously from SNH's side of them saying, well, we're pretty sure the answer is absolutely not, but we'll at least listen. And, there was a long period of mutual education where we tried to educate them that golf could be created in a, 1880s style, using almost no construction and little maintenance, and for us to understand what made that site so fragile and so precious. And as I said, it was all about, fundamentally, it was about the Mach, which is the ecological term given to the blend of grasses, sedges, orchids that grows in the hollows of the site. And in very, very simple language, what it meant was if we used the hollows between the dunes, rather if we wanted to use the hollows between the dunes, that was a no-go. There's no way. If we wanted to use the tops of the dunes, which to a layperson would seem to be the most fragile, where the dune grass is growing, in actual fact, that's not fragile. Those parts are considered a monocrop, relatively uninteresting to an ecologist.
Right.
Of course, from our point of view, it's not brilliant for golf because we'd rather be down in the hollow with all those dunes framing golf greens.
Right.
But there was an impasse. We managed to persuade them that we could not strip the site and regrass it. We could live with the macker if we could only mow it down to a half inch, 3/4 of an inch, if we could roll out the worst of the bumps that existed out there, if we could fill in some of the rabbit scrapes, things like that. If we could create level spots for tees and be able to reseed them with locally harvested pure fescues and effectively do the same for the putting surfaces. If we could take existing scabs and scars and enlarge them into somewhat formalized bunkers, or find areas that were of lesser ecological value and create more formal bunkers. All of these things were eventually agreed on the back of the end game for Scottish Natural Heritage is we create a golf course that causes absolutely minimum disruption to what makes that site special. We create a framework for long-term sustainability that does the same thing, and we protect the rest of the site. The balancing 50-60% of the site that isn't being used for golf will in fact be protected in perpetuity because of the revenues that the golf course would create. And so there you have it, the difficult choice that I and Paul Kimber had to make, where at what point do you say this just isn't worth doing?